everybody. I am here with Rachel. My name is Kelsey, and I'm a senior regional field organizer for the Humane League. And Rachel is one of our newest volunteers. I was incredibly inspired by her story when we first met, and so I wanted to share it with you all. So, Rachel, would you mind maybe sharing a little bit about yourself and introducing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Rachel. I'm from the central Indiana area around Indianapolis. I have been vegetarian slash vegan for probably the last 3 or 4 years. In the area that I grew up in, it was extremely rural, so I was always very exposed to local farmers and the agriculture industry. So, after years of being involved in 4 H and other aspects that involve that industry, I started to realize that it wasn't exactly what I thought it was. So after that, around the college time frame, I went vegan and I've never looked back.
That's awesome. So, can you expand upon that a little bit? Both things, maybe growing up kind of in a rural area and participating in 4 H, and what aspects of that really made you question, whether or not you wanted to participate in that anymore?
Growing up, I loved animals, and I didn't grow up on a farm, but all of the neighbors that I had were farmers. So my parents thought it would be a great idea to get me more involved in 4 H, just being around other types of animals besides the typical companion animals that I grew up with. And so I started working primarily with dairy cattle and in the dairy industry. And I also had some pigs and sheep and other animals as well that weren't necessarily dairy, but they would be sold off to meat. And actually, in the whole scheme of things, I think the whole dairy farm that I was involved with was what changed my mind. Because I think, in a lot of perspectives, factory farmers are the ones that are doing some of those wrongdoings, that the videos that we see so often. But this was a local dairy farmer with less than 100 cattle that I was seeing that they weren't maintaining the barn properly, and there was feces that would go up to the top of your boots, and their cows would be, or the calves would be separated from their mothers almost immediately. And all of these things that you associate with a small farm was happening, or things that you would associate with a factory farm was happening on this small farm. So by probably my ninth year, so typically a 4-H'er does 10 years of 4-H, I got out of the livestock and agriculture industry because I was so frustrated with some of the things that I heard. And at this time, I was actually planning to go to school for agriculture and then changed routes completely when I realized that there wasn't necessarily a split between doing crop science or doing something that was more in relation to some type of product and the agriculture industry, just because they're so intertwined with the products that are grown here are primarily for farms and for livestock. So for me personally, it was working on a dairy farm and being a part of that, because we always associate this violence around the animals being killed. But I also saw a lot of pain in the mothers that had their calves ripped away and being separated and being sit outside in 100-degree weather without food or water for days. One common practice specifically in 4-H is having calves on harnesses for months at a time before the fair so that they would be able to be walked around. And so these calves would have to be standing pretty much all day long and only have limited times for water and food when the farmer would bring that to them. So to me, it was very different than the pets that I had at home that always had access to food and water. And it wasn't that ideal farm that you saw on TV. I started to realize that this was a broken system, and some of these farmers that you expect to do the right thing don't necessarily see that what they're doing is wrong. So for me personally, it was a long journey of me realizing that I was contributing to this, and that the only way that I could stop it wasn't complaining about this local farmer that I had a bad experience with. It was the fact that this could happen anywhere.
Wow, yeah, that's really heartbreaking. And also, just I have so many questions for you because I think as a young person to come to all those realizations and to see that in real life, um, I'm sure just I can't even imagine how that made you feel. So I have a couple of questions. My first one is, were there any animals in particular that you had a special bond with? Or, yeah, maybe let's start there. I'm also wondering about how, if the farmer had any animals that he was particularly fond of or she was particularly fond of. I know you said this was a smaller farm, so there were less than 100 cows there. So yeah, do you think that they were just seen as objects and property, or do you think that they did have, a bond with any of these animals?
I don't think that they had much of a connection with these animals, unfortunately. They had been doing it for generations. So I think that they probably learned very early on to disconnect. For me, I pretty much have a connection with every animal that I meet. I'm the type of person, if I see a stray dog, then they're probably going to be living with me for a while. So I loved all of these animals. But as a child, I think I was, as a young adult, I was expecting for some of these adults to be telling me that if I was doing something wrong, then they would let me know. And I would ask questions, and it was always deflected. This was an organic dairy farm, the type of dairy farm that many people who go and buy their products from a store expect to be treated well. And just to see the living conditions, unfortunately, organic doesn't mean much additional on top of, it doesn't mean that the barns are clean or that the animals have a ton of space to roam, because that's not necessarily the case.
I know I was definitely one of those people who I was vegetarian and I just thought, well, I get my milk from, this small farm, and it's organic, and I just saw nothing wrong with it. I'm curious what your parents said. So you had done 9 out of 10 years of 4-H. You were planning on going to college for agriculture. This was something that was very present, obviously, in your life. And then you just came home one day and you were like, hey, mom and dad, I'm not doing this anymore.
My mother is pretty understanding with most things. My dad, his family actually had dairy cattle and all sorts of animals growing up. So he's less understanding. But I think from their perspective, once I explain things, and I think that everyone has a different journey of figuring out that this is the lifestyle that they want to pursue. For me, I just realized that I couldn't be a part of an industry that was so focused on hurting animals. I think that parents always have, and individuals that are connected with this industry have the best interest. They want to do what's best for them, but they might not have all the facts. And that's the way my parents are too. Now that I explain these things to them and talk to them about why I went vegan, they start to understand why it's so important. But for 4-H, many children are raising animals and essentially making sure that these animals are well taken care of until they go to the fair, but then they have to give them up to market. And these kids are all crying. Most of the time, general public is not allowed to be on the fairgrounds when these animals are taken. And the reason is because these children raise these animals and love them, and then now they're being slaughtered. So I think that my parents definitely understood once I explained it to them, but also this was my plan for 10 years.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there, right, to kind of unpack. I'm definitely interested to hear more about kind of how that relationship with your parents and your neighbors and just this community that you were a part of evolved.
I think around the community, in the small community that I live in currently, it is going to continue to be a struggle with communicating this to people. And I always try to talk about this with them in a patient way, because I do understand that at one point I never thought I would be vegan. And all of these facts were presented to me, and then I changed my mind. And I think that so many are in this mindset of, I've always believed in this, so how am I going to go from eating meat every day for every meal to being vegan? And honestly, I think that that's what they need is facts.
Do you think that these people and your community members could get behind THL's welfare campaigns? Kind of the idea there is that we want to create institutional change. So rather than spending all of this time and all of this energy on changing one person's mind, which only spares a handful of animals, we can actually change an entire industry that positively affects the lives of millions and millions of animals. So asking for more space for these animals, asking for them to be able to perform some of their natural behaviors, asking that, chickens raised aren't raised to grow so large, so fast that they're, kind of literally prisoners of their own body. of course, we don't want to see any animals being, you know, killed for food. We want to end the abuse of animals raised for food. But we do believe that we can make these incremental changes that really have a big impact on not only these animals' lives, but our entire food system. Is that something that do you think farmers in your area or even just community members, your parents, family, friends would be supportive of?
I would say that the majority of people in the community, especially the ones that are 4-Hers or have been 4-Hers and that you saw extremely upset the day that they had to give their animals up, I think that they would be behind this. The challenge is probably going to be more so of what the ag industry is teaching younger people who are going into this industry, because I know when I was interested in doing this, we had done a day camp at Purdue, and that was something that they were talking about was big ag and how to make it more to produce more, and the type of antibiotics that they give their animals and what you need to feed them to make them larger. I know even as a child with our pigs that we had for 4-H, we would get them probably January, and they would be over 200 pounds by the time of the fair in July.
Yeah, so you mentioned that individuals go to these ag conferences and school, and this is what they learn. And it seems like the power really isn't in their individual hands. Of course, we have to hold people responsible, but I know you mentioned Tyson and Purdue, and it seems like they're really the ones that are calling the shots, and we know that, right? That they kind of control everything from the top down. And that a lot of times, farmers and workers are also treated horribly by these big meat companies. So, yeah, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the people aspect of that.
Not one person that I met through 4-H was a bad person. And I know that a lot of them would not have made that choice or not think that way otherwise. So I think the hardest part is trying to convince people to try to support local farmers that aren't doing these things, because Tyson and Purdue, like you said, not only are the animals suffering, but the people are suffering, and they're going to continue to suffer. Many of these people who are working in these facilities have traumatic, not only physical injuries, but mental injuries of having to deal with this day after day. I don't think that would be their first choice. Many of these people who work in ag are wonderful people, and at one point they've cried because they've lost an animal, and that's just a part of the industry. So when it comes down to making change in those bigger organizations, personally, I try to tell people, don't eat meat from Tyson or Purdue. If you can, get it from a local producer if you need it. But, it's going to be a lot to convince people of that, especially right now when factory or farmers markets aren't necessarily available. We do have some in this local community that have tried to stay open and people can pre-order. But I think a lot of, from their personal perspective, I don't think that that's what they want at all. I don't think that they want their animals to live in this way. But as many have seen, especially if you've watched the series Eating Animals or the movie that Natalie Portman directed, which is wonderful, and it's based on a book, it goes through all of these farmers who are forced by these producers to create bigger hens or to produce more eggs or to produce larger animals. And they have zero control over it, and most of them want nothing to do with it. Most of them want to go back to the way it was, but unfortunately they can't survive in that way anymore.
I agree. I think that's all, really great, sound, and realistic advice. I'm really glad that you have this experience and that you really understand the agriculture industry and the Humane League's campaigns and why we focus on welfare campaigns in addition to veg advocacy. So I'm hoping that you can tell me just what you're hoping to get out of volunteering with us. Like what was maybe missing before, or what kind of motivated you, and what do you hope to get out of it?
So my biggest goal is trying to make people more aware of what's happening on these farms, what's happening at these, with Tyson and Purdue, and being able to shed some light on that. So even if you don't decide to go vegan, maybe taking advantage of Meatless Mondays or eating plant-based a few times a week, or even enforcing local change. If there are factory farms in your area, trying to make sure that they know that you're not going to support them unless they change.
That's really great. And I just want to thank you so much for, chatting with me today and sharing your story with the world. It's really inspiring, and I know that I'm really excited to work with you. So, yeah, thank you for
Thank
chatting.
you. Thanks for having me.